So the timing was great, and we released this study on Monday, and I have apologies to a couple of you because you've sat through this twice. So I'll try and throw some new information at you to make it interesting. So very briefly, we had an interesting concept for a best practice group about 3 years ago because of the explosion especially in accelerators. And so we convened a group to become a best practice dialogue among accelerator professionals, and it took off. It just exploded all kind of on its own organically. And among the things that happened there were that there were a really large percentage of the participants that were coming in from corporate accelerators that had never worked in this kind of environment before. And so it became a kind of a mutual support group kind of environment for the challenges they were facing. So I'm going to stop there and take a quick poll. How many of you are Silicon Valley residents now? Okay. How many of you are visiting Silicon Valley? Interesting. How many of you that are visitors have lived here at one time or another? Interesting. Okay, very small number. How many of you were actually born in Silicon Valley? See? You see what's... Okay. You see what's happening is, and this is a kind of continuous cycle, is most of these professionals that we found in that meeting environment were not only new to the profession, they were new to the environment completely. And so they were looking for a place to go to be best practice resources to one another. And that's one of the reasons why this kind of jumped off. Well, among the things we found is there's very little measurement. And so we began to ask some of the corporate participants where they were looking, and they were sort of saying, we're looking at you. Okay, so that gave us a very early indicator that some of our friends at groups like GE were interested in the same questions we were about measurement, and so we took off on this study and really hoped to apply some academic rigor to the discipline. So I've just explained the kind of story of the California Business Incubation Alliance. There is a network of state incubator associations all over the country. California's never had one until now, so that's an interesting little tidbit. There are about 35 of them around the country, and we are formally linked, and so it's an interesting body of professionals. So I'm going to quickly go through the executive summary version of the study that we released. I've got about 3 copies left with me, but they're in the other room, so I'll spare you. But they're available online, and I'll go through that website in a minute. There are a handful of things that we looked at to try and assess some of the best practices we were interrogating at the beginning of the process. Among them, the differences between incubators and accelerators, and part of the way that we tried to define and filter those things is what services they provide. And so among the things that we found they're summarized here and they're detailed in the report, but what we found is that no two programs are alike. I'll give you a defining problem. If you look at the definition of accelerators on AngelList, you get something like 3,000 programs. Isn't that about right, Robbie? Is that about right? If you look at the definition of it on F6S, it's more like 6,000. What is going on there? Well, there's a real problem in basically defining just the fundamental terms, so it's hard to get past that. The other thing that we knew intuitively is that the number of programs exploded. And part of the reason I've included this here is see ya. Thanks. Thank you. So part of the thing that we knew was going on was that the explosion of programs, and that the number of programs had basically doubled since 2010, 2011, but we also knew that no two definitions of these programs were alike. So the guy who's basically our chief economist is a guy called Ian Hathaway. Many of you have read his stuff. He had just in March published a piece in Harvard Business Review featuring this definition of accelerators, which is a pretty confining definition. We used an Israeli intelligence firm because they're smart guys and they could kill us if we didn't use them. And their definition was very different, and they came up with a much larger number. So it's interesting, even when you use 2 incredibly smart people that are steeped in these issues every day, they still don't come up with the same definition. But what they had in common was the explosive growth. And so by any measure, the field has grown tremendously. On the same day that we released this study, one of our partners in this study was the Coffin Fellows Program. Their last cohort that just finished had about 150 or so participants that were in these environments. And so they were perfect subjects for the study. So the kind of co-PI on this from the Coffin Fellows team was a guy called John McIntyre, who was sitting in the Citrix Accelerator. And just to tell you how volatile the corporate accelerator environment is, his program shut down while he was in the study. Made it a great test case. So John's Coffin Fellows study came out on Monday. At literally the same time we were releasing on Monday, he released his in London at a global corporate venture conference and included some of our data, and we launched on Monday and included some of his data. So this is from his study. His was confined to specifically looking at the corporate accelerator market, and here are a couple of really interesting tidbits. This map does not show up. This is a world map, but by far the largest concentration of 105 or so programs that they measured were 37 in the US. And so they again used a fairly confined definition, but that's a smaller number than you might have expected from the 6,000 or so programs that F6S is measuring. So very interesting definition. It also has completely exploded. It's doubled since 2012. And so the really kind of neat thing about that definition is even though it's confined, it still kind of reinforces how much the profession itself has changed and evolved. There's a little gray bar in the study that John released that shows some of the programs that have closed as well. So you could see a lot of volatility. We did a bunch of interviews of people whose programs have closed, including groups like Media Camp, the Time Warner program, a Nike program that was here in San Francisco and is gone. Lots of programs like that. In all those interviews that we conducted more than 100 of our own. John did more than 100 of his. Not one program that closed could we find an instance of a program that closed for any reason related to the program's performance itself. It was always something external, and usually the CFO. Having a bad quarter, having a bad analyst call, having a bad mood, whatever it might be. The kind of top line financial finding of the study is that the portfolio company performance has gone up with the program. So on average, that's a good thing. In total, the kind of top line number that we were able to accumulate since 2004 is that portfolio graduates of all the programs we could measure was about $16.9 billion raised. There are lots of flaws in that data, and I'm very happy to talk to them, but I won't waste your time with them now. Lots of problems measuring how companies have done and whether there's a connective tissue between the money they've raised and the programs they participated in. We also took a look at some of the fields of focus that we thought would be major aspects of the doubling. We thought, for example, there'd be a tremendous jump in fields like big data or in robotics or in some of these spaces. And what we were surprised at was that by far still, to this point today, e-commerce and mobile dominate the landscape. How many cohorts have you done in drones and robotics, Ravi?
Not exclusive. We probably have about 5% of our portfolio.
Yeah. So we thought we were going to go and see these kind of the emerging fields that you read about in the funny papers be responsible for the growth, and they're really not. It's still bread and butter software business every day. We also found that there are very few kind of specialty programs in some of the smaller, basically niche professions like the life sciences, which are really expensive and have much higher barriers to entry. So the part of the main reason accelerators have exploded is the cost of a software accelerator is incredibly light, whereas a wet lab incubator is unbelievably expensive. $50 million in equipment, lots of brick and mortar that has to stay in the ground for years for it to pay back. So there are fundamental problems with the barriers to entry. If you're an entrepreneur, among the many upsides here is that there's pretty much a program or 10 in just about any field you might be an entrepreneur in. You could be in retail, you could be in gaming, you could be in ag tech, and there's a program or several to choose from. Just about anything you could imagine is represented in the fields of concentration. Here was what we thought was the kind of most disappointing aspect of trying to measure. Most programs aren't really tracking their graduated companies much. So they might be tracking what funds those companies have raised, and that's important to entrepreneurs to know whether there's a chance that that number has some affiliation with their participation in those programs. But very few are actually tracking deeper data than that, how much those companies have grown. I think you could say because of the funding number, most companies or most organizations are tracking survival rates, right? But not scientifically. And so among the challenges we found here is that in terms of academic rigor, there's very little study of this field at all. Isn't that not fair, Jeff? Do you think that's a fair statement? So the discipline of studying this space is a difficult one. Key findings, I think this is on the web, and I'll show you the web address in a second. But among them, again, half of this field is new in 5 years. So that's going to lead to lots of kind of infrastructure challenges. it's also full of opportunity because of that. So a very interesting space that has yet to really be defined. You can find a bunch of these details at CTW 2016, as you see there, and the California Business Incubation Alliance continues to have these meetings. We meet every month. We're meeting on June 15th in LA, and we'll continue to do this on a statewide basis and continue to combine accelerators with incubators and see what comes from that conversation. So I think I will stop there.
Great. Thank you very much.